Okay, folks, so welcome to another session of PHI 240. We are getting to work on our class vote unit, and the most popular choice was discussion of the death penalty. We already had one little video session where I laid out some interesting and important facts about the death penalty. Now we're going to start looking at one of the normative arguments about this form of punishment. So we're going to be looking at a paper in favor of the death penalty by Igor Primoratz. Let's get down to work. The plan is basically going to be pretty straightforward. Now that we've got some facts on the table, we're going to look at Primoratz's basic argument for capital punishment. And then we're going to consider the objections that Primoratz is replying to, and we'll discuss the nature of those replies as we work our way through. And that'll be the plan for this quick video. So, Primoratz's argument for the death penalty is pretty straightforward. So, he suggests that there are two ways of thinking about the justification of the death penalty. One is what we might call a retributist view. So a retributist view says punishment is justified if and only if and because it gives a criminal his just deserts. So if you want to figure out what the right punishment for somebody is, you just have to think about the nature of their crime and what sort of punishment is deserved in light of that crime committed. And we might contrast a retributivist approach to criminal justice with a deterrence theory approach. So the idea there would be a punishment is justified if and only if and because it is an efficient way of preventing crime. So with deterrence theory, we might just need to make our punishments strong enough or costly enough to make it not worth a person's while to commit that crime. We might also think about designing our policies so we don't have recidivism. That is, so we don't have people who receive the punishment and once they are freed, just go back to committing the same crime again. So these are two ways of thinking. Now, there's retributivism and there's deterrence. Roughly, we would think that a retributivist theory is a deontological justification. It's a justification that doesn't depend on the results of what happens, whereas a deterrence theory justification of criminal punishment is consequentialist, right? It is a justification that is all about whether we're making the world a better place in enacting, say, a policy of using the death penalty or not using it. Now, these are not the only two approaches to criminal justice. They are simply predominant and much discussed approaches. So sometimes you hear about things like restorative justice, which is not quite either retributivism or deterrence theory. That's a topic for another day. Right now, we're just looking at these two broad approaches. One distinction that we can make between the two is that retributivism is backward-looking, which is to say it's all about things that have happened in the past, right? Whereas a deterrence theory is forward-looking. It's facts about what's going to happen in the future that settles the question of whether some particular punishment is justifiable. Yes, and just to reemphasize, we can think of retributivism as a deontological notion, whereas deterrence is a consequentialist way of thinking about criminal punishment and its justification. So, with that distinction between retributivism and deterrence in mind, we can have a look at Primoratz's main argument. So, here's how he spells out his reasoning. He says, first, the punishment of criminals should be proportionate to the crimes that they commit. That is, justice requires us to make the crime equivalent in some way, or the punishment equivalent to the crime committed. So, for instance, it would be wrong to shoot parking violators on the spot, simply if we realize that as a deterrence theory, it would work great. No one would ever park illegally again if they knew they would be shot for it. So there has to be a matching relationship between the punishment and the crime. So that's the first point, that bad crimes deserve bad punishments, small crimes deserve small punishments, and basically that should settle the question entirely of who to punish, when, and how much. You punish the guilty in proportion to the severity and graveness of the crime committed. Here's premise 2 in Primoratz's argument. He says that the only punishment proportionate to murder is the death penalty. So whereas we thought that shooting a parking violator is clearly an overly excessive punishment for a small crime, we might think that with murder, it's the biggest crime you could possibly imagine, and anything less than the death penalty would be undershooting, right? So the idea would be, if we gave a murderer who commits a crime this bad, then to give them life in prison would be to underpunish them. Right. So we can conclude from this that, therefore, the punishment for murderers should be the death penalty. So we can start to think, is the argument valid? If it were true that the punishment of criminals has to be proportionate to the crime, and the only punishment proportionate to murder is the death penalty, then it does seem to follow that the punishment for murderers should be the death penalty. So we can trust the logical credentials of this argument. We might ask, though, whether the argument is sound. Remember, a sound argument is a valid argument with true premises, and because a valid argument is an argument where, if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. We're asking if we've earned the right to say that 1 is true and 2 is true. So on 1, we might get into an argument with Primoratz about whether proportionality is a justifiable way of thinking about criminal justice. We might begin to wonder whether we're achieving anything of worth by bringing a comparable amount of suffering or hardship into the world on behalf of the state. The next thing that we want to look at is the question about whether the only punishment proportionate to murder is the death penalty. Now, one point that Primoratz grants is that it's not like you have to do the exact same thing to every criminal that they have done to somebody else. So he might point out that if somebody commits robbery or assault. It doesn't mean you have to rob the robber or assault the assaulter. In many of those cases, confining them to prison is just fine. And you can sort of trade one bad thing for another thing. So you can give a certain amount of time of confinement in jail, as it were, in proportion to the badness of the robbery or the assault committed. But Primoratz claims that when it comes to murderer, the only proportionate punishment is the death penalty. Anything less would be to underpunish. We've already worked through that premise, but we might also begin to wonder whether that's true. Does it seem right to us that every single murder, especially in cases where the murderer eventually comes to show remorse, or where the circumstances of the situation were extenuating, we might wonder whether the only proportionate punishment is the death penalty. So we've got these things in mind. Let's then, so we can see from this point that we've got an interesting argument in favor of capital punishment here. What we should do now is the next step, which is, what we find in philosophy papers a lot of the time, which is once a philosopher gives you their view and the main reasons in favor of it. In this case, we've got a proportionality argument. The author will then consider likely objections that they will get from those who want to resist their conclusion. So what we'll now do is run through the objections, how Primoratz characterizes them, and how he responds to them. And the thing you want to be thinking about as you listen to these objections and responses is ask yourself whether Primoratz has given a fair characterization of the objections and whether his responses are successful. So you might think that you might have a different objection in mind to his argument, or you might also think that maybe you've got a better way of responding to the argument than the one that's on offer from Primoratz. And thinking through these sorts of moves in the dialogue, Primoratz says this is what the objection is, and here's how to respond to it. You can always think about how to make the objection better, or figure out a smarter strategy for responding. And that's the work of philosophy. So with that, now let's move on to this series of objections and Primoratz's replies. So here's the first thought. So we'll call this one Objection A, and it says that capital punishment violates a convict's right to life. So the thought here would be, there's a right to life that every person has, and when we sentence someone to death and then execute them, we are violating a right to life. So here's how Primoratz responds. His first response is to claim that murderers forfeit their rights to life. So here's how he puts it. Now that I'm looking at this quote, I do remember that I missed some italics, but just make sure that you get those italics there if you quote this passage for a paper. So he says, would we take seriously the claim to an absolute, sacred, inviolable right to life coming from the mouth of a confessed murderer? I submit that we would not, for the obvious reason that it is being put forward by a person who confessedly denied another human being this very right. But if the murderer cannot plausibly claim any such right for himself, neither can anyone else do that in his behalf. So the thought here is that a murderer cannot insist on someone respecting their right to life if they have not respected it for others. And moreover, that, a non-murderer, myself or you or anybody else trying to speak up on his behalf, could not claim a right to life for someone who does not respect that right. Now, there's an interesting question here. It's about whether a person can lose their right to something just because they don't respect that right for others. So we might think about cases like, privacy. We might wonder whether somebody who violates the privacy of others is required to give up all their own privacy. And we might argue, well, maybe not. Or we might think about a corrupt police officer who does not respect procedural rights for others. We might wonder whether that means we're now allowed to give this corrupt police officer an unfair trial. If you think that that's not the case, then you would disagree with Primoratz, right? You would think that even if you don't have any respect for a certain right, or even if you don't acknowledge it in others, others are still required to acknowledge and respect it in you. So this gets us to a distinction which will also come up in our next piece for later in the week by Nathanson. But it's this distinction between alienable versus inalienable rights. So some rights are alienable. It's the case, for instance, that you have a right to privacy, but you can alienate that right. The thought would be something like, it is actually perfectly within your right to waive your right to not have other people observe you in your home, if you so choose, and you can, set up webcams and let people watch you live out your life at home as much as you see fit, right? So that's a right that you can waive. Then there's the thought that maybe there are certain rights that are never alienable. So a famous example of this from the philosopher John Locke is the thought that you can never alienate your right to freedom. So Locke had the thought that even if you tried, you could never sell yourself into slavery. There's an interesting question there about how Primoratz might treat that, because it seems that Primoratz's view is that as soon as you lose respect for the rights of others, or maybe demonstrate your lack of respect by violating those rights, you lose those very rights in yourself. So it'd be interesting to see if Primoratz would go so far as to say that slaveholders can be enslaved, for instance. So that's one objection that Primoratz raises. The other objection that he raises is the point that even if people have a fundamental right to life, it's not the case that the prohibition on killing is an absolute one. So, remember, an absolute moral rule is just one that you must never break. Well, Primoratz points out that there are some cases where killing is morally justifiable, if not required. So in the case of self-defense, if somebody is coming at you with a knife and the only way you have of protecting yourself is to shoot them, you have the right to shoot them. Or if the only way to win a battle in the war is to kill your opponent, again, you would have the right to kill them. So Primoratz here is just arguing that we would get an implausible overgeneralization if we made the claim that killing is never morally permissible. And in that sense, he thinks that the prohibition on killing is not an absolute one. So, moving on. Here's another objection that you might hear. It's that a criminal law system that kills murderers for killing people is contradictory. The thought here is, if the state wants to discourage the act of killing, they cannot discourage it through committing that very act, the act of killing. So there's something contradictory or incoherent here, is the argument. Okay, so Primoratz, again, we saw an overgeneralization objection in the case of saying that people have an absolute right to life. That was an overgeneralization objection. This, too, is an overgeneralization objection. So Primoratz just points out that just because the state does something to discourage others from doing it doesn't necessarily mean that that's an unjustifiable thing. So he points out that we do put people in jail for kidnapping and confining people. Now the thought would be, if the state has a problem with kidnapping and confining, then they cannot confine prisoners, for confining others, right? I think that the reply that Primoratz can make here is simply that there's justified and unjustified confinements, and there's justified and unjustified killing. And just like justified confinement is the stuff done by the state after a trial and sentencing, justified killing, too, is the killing done by the state after a fair trial, and all of that procedure. Moving on. We might get the objection that capital punishment is not always proportional to murder. So here's the thought. Well, yeah, let's get the thought out a little bit more. So you might think that, well, it might not be proportional to sentence someone to death if the murderer has maybe 60 to 80 good years left in their life, and let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that their victim was 95 years old and on the brink of dying. So the thought would be the payment we're extracting, or the punishment that we are meting out to the wrongdoer, might be depriving them more of that which they deprive from their victim. Now, we might also consider, and Primoratz considers the point that, well, maybe killing someone on death row might be a more painful thing than a murder. So the thought would be, when somebody gets murdered, they're usually not warned about it, that they're going about their life, and then the murder happens rather suddenly. Whereas someone on death row is told that they're going to be killed by the state, and then spends, in many cases, years on death row waiting for the punishment. So death row and eventual execution would only be a proportional response for someone who tells a person for years and years and years that they will kill them and then does it. Well, Primoratz says that kind of thing can happen sometimes. That's an interesting response, because it seems that in that case, he'd be saying that the death penalty is justified, but only in these very specific cases. But his other reply in this argument is that we should treat all lives as equally valuable. So we don't need to run a utilitarian calculus about the question of how many good years a person has left when we consider the wrong of a death, especially willfully brought out via murder. And in that case, then we get the argument back in this proportionality argument that murder merits the loss of your life, no matter specifics about quality of life, nor the specifics about suffering inflicted on the murderer on death row, or the suddenness or painfulness of the murder itself that was committed. Okay, we've just got a couple more objections to think about. So this objection says, well, capital punishment is not justifiable because innocent people will inevitably be executed. Now, the research that I gave you in that facts about the death penalty video, that research suggested that about 4% of people who are executed are in fact innocent. So Primoratz responds to this point. Critics of the death penalty are right that this is an awful thing. It is a truly great injustice when innocent people are sentenced to death. But he goes on to point out, what about the 96% of murderers who actually did it? He says, well, it would be a greater injustice to fail to give these people what they deserve. If we got rid of the death penalty, then all murderers would be given an overly lenient sentence. And the way that Primoratz sees it, we shouldn't lose sight of that injustice, simply because this other great injustice, the execution of innocent people, does sometimes happen. So the thought there might be, insofar as that happens, we should work to get to the number of innocent people executed as close to zero as we possibly can. In Objection E, it's that capital punishment is applied in a discriminatory way. So in the real world, we find that in cases where the murder victim is white, it's more likely the death penalty will be issued than if the murder victim is black. And Primoratz also says that he finds the research convincing, which says that black people are sentenced to death far more often than white murderers. But his point here is simply that this is a problem with the application of capital punishment. So again, he says, insofar as you believe in capital punishment, this issue should just lead you to think that we need to find better ways of putting people to death and sentencing them to death than we currently have. But it doesn't mean, in and of itself, that we should stop giving people what they deserve. So just to sum up a little bit, Primoratz's big idea is that we punish people because they deserve it, right? And he further claims that only capital punishment, only the death penalty, is enough of a punishment for a murderer who violates another person's right to life. So, now I'll leave it to you. What's the best and most forceful objection to capital punishment that you've seen so far? And do you think that that objection ultimately succeeds? And if that's right, what's missing from the discussion so far? So I'll leave that for you to discuss. We'll take this question up in the Zoom meeting as well as in the discussion forums. And later this week, we're going to be looking at Nathanson's essay, An Eye for an Eye. So thanks for listening in today. Be well, and don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any questions. All right, take care, folks. Bye.